Most people believe they think for themselves. That belief is wrong. In reality, the majority of decisions you make every single day are not the result of clear thinking, logic, or evidence, but of habits, emotions, social pressure, cognitive bias, and mental shortcuts you were never taught to question. You are not as rational as you think. Neither am I. And that fact alone quietly controls your money, your beliefs, your relationships, and even your future. Critical thinking. Mastery is not a self-help book. It is not motivational. It does not care about how you feel. Its purpose is far more dangerous. It teaches you how to see reality as it is, not as you want it to be. Once you truly understand critical thinking, you cannot go back to intellectual comfort. You start noticing manipulation everywhere. Advertising, politics, social media, news headlines, influencers, even your own thoughts. And that awareness changes everything. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Intelligent people are often easier to fool than unintelligent ones. Why? Because intelligence without critical thinking creates confidence without accuracy. People who read a lot, speak well, or sound logical often mistake that for truth. This book dismantles that illusion. It shows you that real thinking is not about having opinions. It is about questioning them relentlessly, especially your own. If you have ever wondered why smart people believe obvious lies, why crowds follow nonsense with absolute certainty, or why you sometimes defend ideas that later collapse under scrutiny, the answer lies here. The human brain is not designed to seek truth. It is designed to protect identity, avoid discomfort, and conserve energy. Critical thinking is a skill precisely because it goes against your natural instincts. This book will not make you more agreeable. It will make you harder to deceive. It will teach you how to separate facts from interpretations, logic from emotion, evidence from persuasion. You will learn how arguments are constructed, how fallacies hide inside attractive language, and how assumptions quietly control conclusions without your permission. By the end of this video, you will no longer consume information passively. You will dissect it. You will stop asking, "Do I like this idea?" and start asking, "Is this idea true?" You will stop trusting authority blindly and start demanding reasoning. You will stop confusing confidence with competence and popularity with validity. This is not about becoming skeptical of everything. It is about becoming precise, calm, ruthlessly clear. It is about learning how to think before reacting, how to analyze before agreeing, and how to recognize when your own mind is working against you. If you are looking for comfort, this is not for you. If you are looking for intellectual honesty, mental discipline, and freedom from manipulation, stay until the end. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Thinking. Most people go through life convinced that they are thinking clearly. They believe their opinions are the result of logic. Their decisions are based on facts, and their beliefs are carefully chosen. This belief feels natural and comforting. It is also largely false. What most people call thinking is usually nothing more than reacting. Information enters the mind and triggers an emotional response. That response then looks for justification. The brain does not ask what is true. It asks what feels right, what feels familiar, and what feels safe. Critical thinking begins with accepting this uncomfortable reality. The human brain is not a neutral judge of information. It is a survival machine. Its primary job is to protect you, conserve energy, and help you fit into your social environment. Truth is not its first priority. Efficiency is. This is why the brain relies on shortcuts. These shortcuts are fast, automatic, and mostly invisible. They allow you to navigate the world without stopping to analyze every detail. Without them, daily life would be impossible. But these same shortcuts become dangerous when they are mistaken for reasoning. When you hear a statement that aligns with your existing beliefs, your brain rewards you with a feeling of certainty. That feeling is not evidence, it is chemistry. When you hear something that challenges your beliefs, your brain responds with discomfort. That discomfort is not a sign of falsehood. It is a threat response. Critical thinking requires you to override both reactions. It demands that you distrust comfort and investigate discomfort. Thinking, in its true form, is slow. It requires effort. It consumes mental energy. This is why people avoid it whenever possible. The mind prefers conclusions that arrive quickly and effortlessly. It prefers stories over statistics, confidence over accuracy, and simplicity over complexity. A confident speaker with a weak argument often persuades more effectively than a cautious speaker with strong evidence. This is not because the audience is unintelligent, but because the audience is human. One of the most important ideas in critical thinking mastery is the distinction between having a thought and examining a thought. A thought appears automatically. Examination does not. A thought says this feels true. Examination asks, why does this feel true? A thought seeks agreement. Examination seeks structure. Where did this idea come from? What assumptions does it rely on? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? What alternative explanations exist? These questions do not arise naturally. They must be trained. Most people confuse intelligence with thinking ability. They believe that being educated, articulate, or knowledgeable protects them from error. In reality, intelligence without critical thinking often increases vulnerability. Intelligent people are better at rationalizing their beliefs. They build elegant arguments to defend conclusions they reached emotionally. This creates confidence without accuracy. History is full of brilliant minds who believed foolish things because they never questioned the foundations of their own reasoning. Critical thinking begins with intellectual humility. This does not mean doubting everything or rejecting knowledge. It means recognizing that your mind is capable of error, even when it feels certain. Especially when it feels certain. Confidence is not proof. Consensus is not proof. Authority is not proof. Popularity is not proof. Proof comes from evidence and reasoning, not from how strongly something is believed. Another illusion this chapter dismantles is the idea that opinions are harmless. People often say, everyone is entitled to their opinion. That is true in a moral sense, but false in an intellectual one. Opinions shape decisions. Decisions shape actions. Actions shape outcomes. Poor thinking does not stay in the mind. It spreads into behavior, systems, and societies. When people stop caring whether their beliefs are true, reality eventually imposes consequences. Thinking critically does not mean becoming negative or cynical. It means becoming precise. Precision requires defining terms clearly. Many arguments collapse when definitions are examined. Words like success, freedom, intelligence, fairness, and truth are often used without agreement on what they mean. When definitions are vague, conclusions become meaningless. Critical thinkers slow down and clarify language before accepting arguments built on it. This chapter also introduces the idea that thinking is a skill, not a trait. You are not born a critical thinker. You are trained into one. Just as physical strength increases through resistance, mental clarity increases through challenge. Every time you question an assumption, examine a belief, or change your mind based on evidence, you strengthen this skill. Every time you accept information passively, you weaken it. One of the hardest barriers to real thinking is identity. People fuse beliefs with who they are. When a belief is challenged, it feels like a personal attack. The brain responds defensively. This shuts down analysis. Critical thinking requires separating identity from ideas. You are not your opinions. You can change a belief without losing your worth. In fact, the ability to change your mind when evidence demands it is a sign of intellectual strength, not weakness. The chapter emphasizes that critical thinking is not about winning arguments. It is about reducing error. A person who changes their mind after discovering a flaw in their reasoning has not lost. They have improved their understanding. Unfortunately, modern culture rewards certainty and punishes doubt. Admitting uncertainty is often seen as incompetence. In reality, uncertainty is the starting point of knowledge. Honest thinkers are comfortable saying, "I do not know yet." Another key concept explored here is the difference between explanation and justification. Explanation seeks truth. Justification seeks defense. When people explain, they are open to correction. When they justify, they are committed to being right. Critical thinking requires a constant shift toward explanation. Ask yourself whether you are trying to understand or trying to protect your position. The answer reveals the quality of your thinking in that moment. This chapter also warns against the illusion of neutrality. Everyone has biases. Pretending to be objective without acknowledging bias makes those biases stronger. Critical thinkers do not claim neutrality. They actively look for their blind spots. They ask what they might be missing. They seek out opposing views, not to argue, but to test their own reasoning. Disagreement becomes a tool, not a threat. As the chapter draws to a close, it delivers a central truth of critical thinking mastery. Thinking is not automatic. It is an act of discipline. It requires patience, honesty, and courage. Courage to face uncertainty, courage to admit error, courage to stand apart from the crowd when evidence demands it. The world does not reward this kind of thinking immediately. In fact, it often punishes it. But over time, clarity becomes power. Once you understand that most thinking is illusion, you gain the opportunity to do something rare. You can begin thinking on purpose. You can slow down conclusions, question assumptions, and choose understanding over comfort. This is not easy. It was never meant to be. But it is the foundation of intellectual freedom. And without that freedom, every other form of freedom is fragile. Chapter 2. Cognitive Biases. The silent forces that control your mind. The greatest obstacle to clear thinking is not ignorance. It is distortion. Cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that operate beneath awareness, shaping perception, judgment, and decision-making without asking for permission. They do not announce themselves. They feel natural. They feel reasonable. And that is exactly why they are dangerous. This chapter exposes the invisible mechanisms that quietly bend reality inside the mind while convincing you that you are seeing things objectively. The human brain evolved for survival, not for truth. In an uncertain and dangerous environment, speed mattered more than accuracy. A fast wrong conclusion was often safer than a slow correct one. Over thousands of years, this shaped a mind that favors shortcuts. These shortcuts reduce mental effort, conserve energy, and allow quick responses. In modern life, however, these same shortcuts create predictable errors. Cognitive biases are not personal flaws. They are built-in features. Pretending you are immune to them only guarantees their control over you. One of the most powerful biases is confirmation bias. This is the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that supports existing beliefs while ignoring or dismissing information that contradicts them. Once you believe something, your mind becomes a lawyer, not a judge. It builds a case for what you already think is true. News articles that agree with you feel credible. Those that challenge you feel suspicious. Evidence that supports your view feels strong. Evidence against it feels weak or flawed. This process happens automatically. No conscious dishonesty is required. Confirmation bias explains why people can live in completely different realities while sharing the same world. Two individuals can read the same headline and walk away with opposite conclusions, each convinced the facts are on their side. This bias is amplified by modern algorithms that feed you information aligned with your preferences. Over time, your worldview becomes narrower, more confident, and less accurate. The danger is not disagreement. The danger is certainty built on selective exposure. Another critical bias is availability bias. The mind judges probability based on how easily examples come to mind. Events that are vivid, emotional, or recent feel more common than they actually are. This is why people often overestimate the likelihood of dramatic but rare events while underestimating common but less emotional risks. A plane crash dominates memory. Car accidents fade into the background. Media coverage intensifies this effect. Repetition creates perceived frequency. Emotional impact creates perceived importance. Reality becomes distorted by attention. Authority bias is equally influential. Humans are social creatures. Trusting leaders and experts has survival value. But authority bias causes people to accept claims simply because they come from someone perceived as knowledgeable, confident, or powerful. Titles replace evidence. Confidence replaces reasoning. This bias does not disappear with education. In fact, educated individuals may be even more susceptible because they trust institutions and credentials deeply. Critical thinking requires respect for expertise without surrendering judgment to it. Another silent force is the halo effect. This bias occurs when one positive trait influences overall perception. If someone is attractive, articulate, or successful, their ideas are assumed to be intelligent. If someone appears awkward or unpolished, their ideas are dismissed. This shortcut saves time, but sacrifices accuracy. Truth does not care about presentation. Arguments stand or fall based on logic and evidence, not charisma. Anchoring bias demonstrates how first impressions shape later judgments. The first number you hear influences how you evaluate all subsequent numbers, even if the first is irrelevant. The first explanation you hear frames how you interpret later information. This is why early narratives are so powerful and so dangerous. Once an anchor is set, adjusting away from it requires effort. Most people adjust insufficiently, remaining closer to the initial idea than evidence justifies. One of the most uncomfortable biases to confront is self-serving bias. People tend to attribute successes to internal qualities and failures to external factors. When things go well, it is because of intelligence or effort. When things go badly, it is because of circumstances or other people. This protects self-esteem but prevents learning. Growth requires accurate attribution. If you never take responsibility for error, you never correct it. Critical thinking demands honesty about your own role in outcomes. The illusion of understanding is another trap. People often believe they understand complex systems far better than they do. Ask someone to explain how a familiar object works in detail, and confidence collapses quickly. This gap between perceived and actual understanding leads to overconfidence in opinions on topics that require deep expertise. Recognizing the limits of your knowledge is not weakness. It is the beginning of wisdom. Perhaps the most dangerous bias of all is bias blind spot. This is the tendency to recognize biases in others while believing yourself to be objective. People readily describe how media manipulates, how crowds are irrational, how others are emotionally driven. Rarely do they apply the same skepticism inward. True critical thinkers assume bias first, not last. They treat their own conclusions with suspicion and actively look for flaws in their reasoning. Awareness of bias is necessary, but insufficient. Knowing biases exist does not neutralize them. The brain is skilled at acknowledging a bias intellectually while continuing to operate under its influence. Mastery requires systems, deliberate strategies that reduce distortion, seeking disconfirming evidence, slowing down decisions that feel obvious, separating facts from interpretations, writing out reasoning steps instead of trusting intuition, inviting criticism from people who disagree honestly. Critical thinkers also understand that emotional intensity is a warning signal. The stronger your emotional reaction to an idea, the more likely bias is involved. Emotion narrows attention and accelerates judgment. This does not mean emotions are useless. They provide information, but they are poor judges of truth. When emotions spike, thinking quality drops. Learning to pause in these moments is a key discipline. This chapter emphasizes that bias reduction is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming accurate. Accuracy requires effort. It requires humility. It requires accepting that your mind is not a reliable narrator of reality. This realization is unsettling. It challenges the comforting belief that you see the world as it is. But it also opens the door to clarity. As this chapter concludes, a central principle emerges. You cannot eliminate cognitive biases, but you can manage them. You cannot trust your mind blindly, but you can design thinking habits that compensate for its weaknesses. The goal of critical thinking mastery is not perfection. It is progress. Fewer errors, better judgments, slower certainty, deeper understanding. Once you accept that your mind is both powerful and flawed, you gain control. You stop asking whether you are biased and start asking how you are biased in this moment. That question alone changes how you engage with information. It transforms thinking from a passive reaction into an active practice. And that shift marks the difference between being controlled by your mind and learning how to use it. Chapter 3. Asking better questions. The discipline that separates thinkers from believers. Most people believe that intelligence is measured by how many answers you have. In reality, intelligence reveals itself in the quality of the questions you ask. Answers can be memorized, borrowed, repeated, or inherited. Questions cannot. They expose how a mind works. They reveal whether a person is searching for truth or merely for confirmation. This chapter focuses on the single most practical skill in critical thinking mastery, the ability to ask better questions, especially when certainty feels tempting. Poor thinking almost always begins with a poorly framed question. When the question is wrong, even a correct answer leads you in the wrong direction. For example, asking, "Who is right in this argument?" assumes that one side must be correct. Asking, "What evidence supports each claim and where does it fail?" opens the door to understanding. The first question seeks victory. The second seeks accuracy. Critical thinkers train themselves to recognize the hidden assumptions embedded in the questions they ask and the questions presented to them. The human mind prefers closed questions, questions that demand a simple yes or no. These questions reduce complexity and provide emotional relief. But reality is rarely binary. Closed questions shut down exploration. Open questions invite analysis. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" a critical thinker asks, "Under what conditions would this be true, and under what conditions would it fail?" Instead of asking, "Do I agree with this?" they ask, "What would convince a reasonable person who disagrees?" This shift changes everything. One of the most important distinctions introduced in this chapter is the difference between questions that seek validation and questions that seek understanding. Validation questions sound like curiosity, but their purpose is reassurance. They are designed to confirm existing beliefs. Understanding questions are uncomfortable. They risk destabilizing what you think you know. Most people avoid them instinctively. Critical thinking mastery requires moving toward discomfort deliberately. Another core concept is the anatomy of an argument. Every argument is built from claims, reasons, and evidence. A claim is what someone is asserting. A reason explains why they believe it. Evidence supports the reason. Weak thinking often skips this structure entirely. People respond to conclusions without examining how they were built. Critical thinkers slow the process down. They ask what exactly is being claimed. They ask why the claim is believed. They ask what evidence supports it and whether that evidence is relevant, reliable, and sufficient. This chapter emphasizes that disagreement is not the enemy of thinking. Confusion is not the enemy. Uncertainty is not the enemy. The true enemy is premature certainty. The moment you feel completely sure, questioning stops. When questioning stops, learning stops. Critical thinkers remain curious even when they disagree strongly. They understand that disagreement is a tool for refinement, not a threat to identity. A powerful questioning habit explored here is the ability to ask, "What am I assuming?" Assumptions are beliefs taken for granted without proof. They operate silently. Every argument rests on assumptions, whether acknowledged or not. When assumptions go unexamined, conclusions feel stronger than they deserve. By identifying assumptions, you expose the fragile foundation beneath confident claims. Often, entire arguments collapse once a single assumption is challenged. Another essential question is, how could I be wrong? This question feels unnatural because it runs directly against the ego. The mind prefers to protect self-image, not to expose weakness. But this question is transformative. It forces you to imagine alternative explanations. It invites disconfirming evidence. It shifts thinking from defense to exploration. Asking how you could be wrong does not mean assuming you are wrong. It means refusing to assume you are right without examination. The chapter also addresses the difference between explanation and persuasion. Many questions are asked not to understand, but to influence. Leading questions guide others toward a desired conclusion. Loaded questions smuggle assumptions into the conversation. Critical thinkers learn to recognize when questions are being used as tools of manipulation rather than inquiry. They listen not only to answers, but to the structure of the questions themselves. Another critical idea explored is the role of context. Facts do not exist in isolation. A statement can be technically true and still misleading if context is ignored. Asking better questions means asking about scope, conditions, time frame, and comparison. Compared to what? True under what circumstances? Relevant to which outcome? Context transforms information from fragments into understanding. This chapter also explains why speed is the enemy of good questioning. Fast conversations reward confidence and quick responses. Slow thinking appears weak in environments obsessed with performance. Critical thinkers resist this pressure. They pause. They ask clarifying questions. They request definitions. They revisit earlier assumptions. This patience is often mistaken for indecision. In reality, it is discipline. One of the most practical tools introduced is the habit of separating facts from interpretations. Facts describe what can be verified. Interpretations explain what those facts mean. Most arguments confuse the two. People state interpretations as facts and then defend them aggressively. Asking better questions means constantly asking, what part of this is observation and what part is interpretation? This simple distinction dissolves many unnecessary conflicts. The chapter also confronts a hard truth. Many people do not want answers. They want certainty, belonging, and identity reinforcement. Asking real questions threatens those comforts. This is why critical thinkers often feel isolated. They are not easily satisfied by slogans, simple narratives, or popular opinions. They require depth. They require reasoning. They require evidence. This makes them harder to manipulate but also harder to please. Another key insight is that good questions evolve. As understanding grows, questions become more precise. Early questions are broad. Later questions are sharper. This progression signals learning. People who ask the same questions repeatedly without refinement are often stuck. Critical thinkers track how their questions change over time. This reveals whether they are actually learning or merely circling familiar ground. As the chapter approaches its conclusion, it emphasizes that questioning is not a technique you apply occasionally. It is a posture toward reality, a stance of openness combined with rigor, curiosity combined with discipline, skepticism combined with humility. Asking better questions is not about doubting everything. It is about earning belief through examination rather than inheritance. The chapter ends with a defining principle of critical thinking mastery. You do not become wiser by collecting answers. You become wiser by learning how to interrogate them. Every clear conclusion rests on a foundation of good questions. Without them, even correct answers are fragile. With them, understanding deepens, errors shrink, and thinking becomes an intentional act rather than an automatic reaction. When you master the art of questioning, reality becomes clearer. Not because it becomes simpler, but because you learn how to navigate complexity without fear. And in a world overflowing with information but starving for understanding, that skill is nothing less than intellectual independence. Chapter 4: Evidence, Reasoning, and the Discipline of Truth. Most people believe that evidence speaks for itself. It does not. Evidence is silent until the mind interprets it, organizes it, and places it within a structure of reasoning. This chapter focuses on the critical bridge between information and understanding, how evidence is evaluated, how reasoning connects facts to conclusions, and how easily the appearance of proof can replace proof itself. Mastering critical thinking requires learning not just to ask questions, but to demand justification that survives careful examination. Evidence is often confused with information. Information is abundant. Evidence is selective. Evidence is information that directly supports or challenges a specific claim. Without a clear claim, evidence has no meaning. This is why many arguments feel convincing while being logically empty. They present large amounts of data without explaining what that data is supposed to demonstrate. Critical thinkers never ask, "Is there information?" They ask, "What claim is this information meant to support, and how well does it actually do that?" One of the first lessons in this chapter is that not all evidence is equal. Anecdotes feel powerful because they are concrete and emotional. Statistics feel authoritative because they are numerical. Expert opinions feel reliable because they come from perceived authority. Each of these can be useful, but none are automatically trustworthy. Anecdotes are vulnerable to bias and limited perspective. Statistics can be manipulated through framing and selection. Experts can be wrong, conflicted, or speaking outside their domain. Critical thinking requires evaluating evidence based on relevance, reliability, and sufficiency, not on how persuasive it feels. Relevance asks whether the evidence actually relates to the claim. Many arguments rely on information that is true but irrelevant. Reliability asks whether the source of the evidence is credible and whether the method of obtaining it is sound. Sufficiency asks whether the amount of evidence is enough to justify the conclusion. A single supporting fact rarely proves a broad claim. Strong conclusions require strong support. Weak evidence can support only tentative conclusions. This chapter emphasizes the danger of reasoning backward from conclusions. Many people decide what they want to believe first and then search for evidence afterward. This feels like reasoning, But it is not. It is justification. True reasoning moves in the opposite direction. It begins with evidence and allows conclusions to emerge gradually, even if they are uncomfortable. This discipline requires patience and emotional control. The mind resists it because uncertainty feels threatening. But without this discipline, beliefs become fixed and learning stops. Another core idea explored here is the difference between correlation and causation. Two events occurring together does not mean one causes the other. This error appears everywhere, from personal decision-making to public policy. People notice patterns and assume explanations without testing alternatives. Critical thinkers slow down and ask what other factors might be involved. They ask whether the relationship is consistent, whether it makes sense mechanistically, and whether alternative explanations have been ruled out. Without these questions, conclusions are fragile. The chapter also addresses logical fallacies, not as a list to memorize, but as patterns of failure in reasoning. Fallacies are not tricks used only by dishonest people. They are common shortcuts the brain uses when thinking feels difficult. Attacking a person instead of addressing their argument. Appealing to popularity instead of evidence. Presenting false dilemmas where more possibilities exist. These errors feel persuasive because they simplify complexity. Recognizing them requires slowing down and examining how a conclusion was reached, not just what conclusion was reached. One particularly dangerous fallacy discussed is motivated reasoning. This occurs when emotional investment influences how evidence is evaluated. Evidence supporting a desired conclusion is accepted quickly and uncritically. Evidence challenging it is scrutinized harshly or dismissed entirely. This double standard operates automatically. Critical thinking mastery requires applying the same level of scrutiny to supporting evidence as to opposing evidence. This symmetry is rare but essential. This chapter also explores probabilistic thinking. Most real-world conclusions are not certain. They are likely to varying degrees. People struggle with this because they prefer certainty. They want clear answers and firm positions. But reality does not cooperate. Critical thinkers learn to think in terms of likelihood rather than absolutes. They adjust confidence as new evidence appears. Changing your mind is not failure, it is calibration. Another important theme is the burden of proof. Whoever makes a claim is responsible for supporting it. Yet in many discussions, this responsibility is reversed. Skeptics are asked to disprove unsupported assertions. This shift allows weak claims to survive without evidence. Critical thinkers resist this. They ask what evidence justifies the claim in the first place. Absence of disproof is not proof. The chapter also highlights the importance of proportional belief. The strength of your belief should match the strength of the evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Ordinary claims require less. Problems arise when people hold extreme certainty based on minimal support. This imbalance creates dogmatism. Critical thinking restores balance by aligning confidence with justification. Another subtle but powerful idea introduced is the difference between explanation and prediction. A good explanation accounts for existing data. A strong explanation also predicts future observations. Many explanations sound convincing after the fact, but fail to predict anything new. Critical thinkers value predictive power because it demonstrates genuine understanding rather than narrative skill. The chapter emphasizes that reasoning is not a solitary activity. Other minds serve as mirrors, revealing blind spots you cannot see alone. This is why disagreement is valuable. Not all criticism is good, but honest critique strengthens thinking. Critical thinkers seek environments where ideas can be challenged without hostility. They understand that social comfort often conflicts with intellectual growth. As the chapter moves toward its conclusion, It returns to a central theme of critical thinking mastery. Truth is not found through force of belief, volume of repetition, or confidence of delivery. It is approached through disciplined reasoning, applied consistently over time. This discipline is demanding. It requires resisting shortcuts that feel natural. It requires tolerating uncertainty longer than most people are willing to tolerate it. The chapter ends with a clear message. Evidence does not guarantee truth. Reasoning does not guarantee correctness. But without evidence and reasoning, truth has no chance at all. Critical thinking mastery is not about eliminating error completely. It is about reducing error systematically. It is about building habits of mind that make you harder to fool, including by yourself. When you learn to evaluate evidence carefully and reason deliberately, beliefs become tools rather than identities. Conclusions become flexible rather than rigid. Understanding deepens not because the world becomes simpler, but because your thinking becomes stronger. And in a world saturated with information but starved for wisdom, that strength is a rare and valuable advantage. Chapter 5. Thinking clearly under pressure. Decisions, emotions, and mental discipline. Clear thinking is easiest when nothing is at stake. When emotions are low, time is abundant, and consequences feel distant, reasoning flows smoothly. Unfortunately, the most important decisions in life are made under the opposite conditions. Pressure, uncertainty, fear, urgency, and social expectation distort judgment precisely when clarity matters most. This chapter focuses on how critical thinking functions in real-life situations, not in calm intellectual exercises, but in moments where emotion competes with reason and speed tempts error. The human mind treats pressure as a threat. When stakes rise, the brain shifts into protection mode. Attention narrows. Time feels compressed. The desire for immediate resolution increases. These changes are useful for survival, but they are hostile to careful reasoning. Under pressure, people rely more heavily on intuition, habit, and social cues. This is why smart individuals make poor decisions in moments of stress. The problem is not lack of intelligence. It is loss of cognitive control. One of the most dangerous effects of pressure is emotional hijacking. Emotions are not irrational by nature. They carry information. Fear signals risk. Anger signals perceived injustice. Excitement signals opportunity. But emotions are poor strategists. When emotions dominate, they push for action before understanding. Critical thinking under pressure requires learning how to acknowledge emotion without surrendering to it. This chapter emphasizes a vital distinction between urgency and importance. Urgent decisions feel important because they demand immediate attention. Important decisions deserve attention because their consequences are lasting. Pressure often reverses priorities. People respond quickly to what feels urgent and neglect what truly matters. Clear thinkers slow down artificially when stakes are high. They create space even when time seems scarce. This pause is not weakness. It is control. Another concept explored here is decision framing. The way a decision is presented influences how it is evaluated. A choice framed as avoiding loss feels different from the same choice framed as achieving gain. Under pressure, framing effects intensify. Critical thinkers learn to reframe decisions deliberately. They ask what the decision looks like when described neutrally. They ask what is gained, what is lost, and compared to what alternative. Reframing restores perspective. Social pressure is another powerful force discussed in this chapter. Humans are deeply sensitive to group approval. Disagreement feels risky. Conformity feels safe. Under pressure, people often outsource thinking to authority, consensus, or tradition. They follow what others are doing instead of evaluating what makes sense. This behavior reduces anxiety but increases error. Critical thinking requires the courage to think independently, even when isolation feels uncomfortable. The chapter also explores time pressure and its impact on reasoning quality. When time is limited, people simplify problems aggressively. They reduce options prematurely. They accept the first solution that feels acceptable rather than searching for the best one. This is known as satisficing. While sometimes necessary, satisficing becomes dangerous when applied automatically. Critical thinkers distinguish between decisions that require speed and those that require accuracy. Not every fast decision is justified. Another key idea introduced is the difference between reversible and irreversible decisions. Reversible decisions can be adjusted later. Irreversible decisions lock in consequences. Under pressure, people often treat irreversible decisions as if they were reversible. Clear thinkers do the opposite. They protect irreversible decisions with extra scrutiny and allow reversible decisions to move faster. This simple classification improves decision quality dramatically. The chapter also examines how stress distorts risk perception. Under stress, people either become overly cautious or recklessly bold. Some avoid risk entirely, missing opportunity. Others chase risk impulsively, ignoring downside. Both reactions stem from emotional imbalance. Critical thinking restores proportionality. One practical tool discussed is pre-commitment. This involves deciding in advance how you will think and act under pressure. Athletes, pilots, and emergency responders use this technique routinely. They establish rules and checklists before emotion interferes. Critical thinkers do the same in everyday life. They decide in advance what standards of evidence they require, what questions they will ask, and what signals will trigger a pause. Preparation protects clarity. Another important theme is fatigue. Mental exhaustion reduces self-control and increases reliance on shortcuts. Under fatigue, people become more suggestible, more impulsive, and more confident in weak conclusions. Critical thinkers respect cognitive limits. They avoid making high-stakes decisions when tired, hungry, or emotionally overwhelmed whenever possible. This is not avoidance. It is strategic self-management. The chapter also challenges the myth of multitasking. Under pressure, people attempt to manage multiple demands simultaneously. This fragments attention and degrades reasoning. Critical thinking requires focus. Even brief moments of full attention improve decision quality. The discipline to single task under pressure is rare and powerful. Another subtle danger explored is narrative bias. Under stress, the mind seeks simple stories. It wants clear villains, heroes, causes, and solutions. Reality is usually messier. Simple narratives feel comforting, but often mislead. Critical thinkers resist the urge to compress complexity prematurely. They tolerate ambiguity longer than others. This tolerance allows better models of reality to form. The chapter also addresses regret avoidance. Many decisions are driven not by what is best, but by what minimizes future regret. This leads to defensive choices that feel safe but limit growth. Critical thinkers distinguish between regret caused by bad outcomes and regret caused by poor reasoning. You can make a well-reasoned decision that leads to a bad outcome. That is not failure. Failure is abandoning reasoning for comfort. As the chapter progresses, it emphasizes emotional regulation as a thinking skill. Managing emotion does not mean suppressing it. It means preventing emotion from dictating conclusions. Techniques such as labeling emotion, delaying response, and externalizing reasoning help restore balance. These techniques do not eliminate pressure. They reduce its control. Another important concept is post-decision review. Critical thinkers analyze decisions after outcomes are known, not to judge themselves, but to refine their process. They ask whether reasoning was sound regardless of outcome. This separates learning from self-blame. Over time, this practice builds resilience and accuracy. The chapter concludes with a powerful message. The quality of your thinking is most visible under pressure. Anyone can reason calmly when nothing matters. Mastery appears when stakes are high and clarity is scarce. Critical thinking is not a luxury reserved for quiet moments. It is a discipline designed for chaos. When you learn to slow down under pressure, regulate emotion, resist social pull, and protect irreversible decisions, you gain an advantage that compounds over time. You stop reacting and start choosing. In a world that rewards speed and confidence, this discipline is rare, and rarity is power. Critical thinking mastery is not about eliminating pressure from life. That is impossible. It is about building a mind that remains steady when pressure arrives. And that ability, more than raw intelligence or knowledge, determines whether decisions move you closer to truth or quietly pull you away from it. Chapter 6. Independent Thinking in a World that Rewards Conformity. Independent thinking is often praised in theory and punished in practice. Society claims to value originality, critical analysis, and intellectual courage, yet it consistently rewards agreement, obedience, and predictability. This chapter examines one of the most difficult aspects of critical thinking mastery: maintaining intellectual independence in environments designed to discourage it. Thinking clearly is not only a cognitive challenge, it is a social one. Human beings are deeply social by nature. From an early age, survival depended on belonging. Acceptance meant protection. Rejection meant danger. This evolutionary pressure still shapes behavior today. The brain treats social exclusion as a threat. Disagreement triggers anxiety. Standing apart from the group feels risky, even when logic demands it. Independent thinking, therefore, requires more than intelligence. It requires emotional strength. One of the first illusions this chapter dismantles is the idea that most people form beliefs independently. In reality, beliefs are often inherited. They are absorbed from family, culture, education, media, and peer groups long before they are examined. Once adopted, they feel personal. Challenging them feels like self-betrayal. Critical thinking begins when you recognize how few of your beliefs you actually chose deliberately. Social proof is one of the most powerful forces shaping belief. When many people appear to agree on something, the mind interprets agreement as evidence. Popularity feels like validation. This shortcut saves effort but sacrifices accuracy. History repeatedly shows that large groups can be confidently wrong. Consensus is not truth. It is a social signal. Independent thinkers learn to separate the comfort of agreement from the reliability of evidence. This chapter explores the cost of conformity. When people suppress doubts to avoid conflict, errors multiply silently. Organizations make poor decisions not because individuals lack insight, but because they lack permission to speak honestly. The fear of being wrong publicly often outweighs the fear of being wrong privately. Critical thinking requires reversing this priority. Accuracy must matter more than approval. Another concept examined here is identity-based belief. People often adopt positions not because they are true, but because they signal belonging. Political views, moral stances, and lifestyle choices become markers of identity. Once beliefs serve identity, they become resistant to evidence. Changing your mind feels like abandoning your group. Independent thinkers resist this fusion. They allow beliefs to change without feeling that their identity is under threat. The chapter also addresses the role of language in enforcing conformity. Certain words frame debate in ways that discourage questioning. Labels simplify complexity, and discourage nuance. When issues are framed as moral absolutes, critical analysis is mistaken for disloyalty. Independent thinkers learn to recognize when language is being used to shut down thought rather than to clarify it. Another powerful force discussed is authority pressure. People often defer to leaders, experts, or institutions even when something feels wrong. This deference is not always irrational. Expertise matters, but blind obedience replaces reasoning with trust. Critical thinkers respect authority without surrendering judgment. They ask what the authority is claiming, what evidence supports it, and what limitations exist. They understand that expertise increases the probability of correctness, not the guarantee. The chapter also explores how fear of isolation shapes behavior online. Social media intensifies conformity by making agreement visible and disagreement costly. Likes and shares reward alignment. Silence becomes safer than dissent. Over time, people self-censor without being asked. Independent thinking erodes quietly. Critical thinkers resist this pressure by evaluating ideas privately before expressing them publicly. They value internal clarity over external validation. Another key idea introduced is pluralistic ignorance. This occurs when individuals privately reject a belief, but publicly accept it because they assume others believe it. As a result, a false consensus appears to exist. This phenomenon explains how weak ideas survive and spread. Independent thinkers break this cycle by expressing uncertainty honestly. Sometimes clarity emerges not from certainty, but from the courage to say something feels wrong. The chapter emphasizes that independent thinking does not mean reflexive opposition. Disagreeing with everything is not thinking. It is another form of conformity, just inverted. True independence means evaluating each claim on its merits, regardless of who supports it. Sometimes the crowd is right. Sometimes authority is correct. Independent thinkers are comfortable agreeing when evidence supports it, and disagreeing when it does not. Another challenge explored is intellectual loneliness. Thinking independently can feel isolating. When others prefer simple narratives, careful analysis can feel unwelcome. Critical thinkers often find fewer people willing to engage deeply. This loneliness is not a sign of failure. It is a cost. Understanding this cost in advance prevents discouragement. Independence is not meant to be easy. It is meant to be honest. The chapter also introduces strategies for protecting independent thought. One strategy is delayed opinion formation. Instead of reacting immediately, critical thinkers give themselves time to examine evidence and perspectives. Another strategy is intellectual diversification. Exposing yourself to high-quality disagreement strengthens reasoning. Avoiding echo chambers is not about balance for its own sake. It is about stress-testing ideas. Another important discipline discussed is separating social consequences from factual evaluation. An idea does not become true or false based on how others react to it. Emotional reactions are data about people, not about reality. Independent thinkers notice reactions without letting them override reasoning. The chapter also highlights the importance of internal standards. When external validation becomes the measure of correctness, thinking deteriorates. Critical thinkers develop internal criteria for belief: evidence quality, logical coherence, predictive power. These standards remain stable even when social feedback fluctuates. This stability creates intellectual resilience. As the chapter moves forward, it examines courage not as fearlessness, but as the willingness to tolerate discomfort. Independent thinking produces discomfort, doubt, uncertainty, social tension. Critical thinkers accept these experiences as part of the process. They do not seek conflict, but they do not avoid it when truth is at stake. The chapter also addresses the danger of moral grandstanding. Public displays of certainty often replace private reasoning. People signal virtue instead of seeking understanding. Independent thinkers resist this temptation. They prioritize correctness over appearance, quiet clarity over loud confidence. As the chapter approaches its conclusion, it returns to a central message. Independent thinking is not rebellion, it is responsibility. When you think independently, you reduce the spread of error. You improve decision-making not only for yourself, but for systems that depend on honest reasoning. This responsibility is heavy. Most people avoid it. That avoidance shapes the world more than malice ever could. The chapter ends with a defining insight. Freedom of thought is meaningless without the discipline to use it well. Independent thinking is not guaranteed by the absence of control. It is earned through effort, humility, and courage. When you develop this discipline, you gain something rare: the ability to stand calmly in disagreement without hostility, to change your mind without shame, to hold beliefs lightly and evidence firmly. In a world that rewards conformity and speed, independent thinking feels slow and costly. But over time, it becomes an advantage that compounds. You become harder to mislead, harder to manipulate, and harder to pressure into error. And that, more than popularity or approval, is the true reward of critical thinking mastery. Chapter 7: Building a System for Lifelong Critical Thinking. Critical thinking is often treated as a tool used occasionally, something you apply when problems become complex or decisions feel important. This view is incomplete. True mastery comes when critical thinking becomes a system rather than a reaction. A system does not depend on mood, motivation, or circumstance. It operates consistently over time. This chapter focuses on how to build such a system, one that supports clear thinking not just in isolated moments, but across an entire life. Most people rely on willpower to think well. Willpower is unreliable. It fluctuates with fatigue, stress, emotion, and distraction. When willpower fades, habits take over. This is why poor thinking repeats itself even among intelligent people. A system replaces willpower with structure. It embeds good thinking into routines, standards, and processes that function even when attention is low. The first element of a critical thinking system is intentional input control. The quality of thinking cannot exceed the quality of information consumed. Many people expose themselves to a constant stream of fragmented, emotionally charged, and low-quality content. This trains the mind to react rather than reflect. Critical thinkers curate their inputs deliberately. They limit exposure to sources designed to provoke emotion without providing depth. They prioritize sources that value evidence, uncertainty, and correction over certainty and outrage. Input control also involves pacing. Constant consumption leaves no time for digestion. Information requires processing to become understanding. A critical thinking system includes deliberate pauses, time to reflect, summarize, and question what has been absorbed. Without reflection, even high-quality information remains shallow. The second element is structured reflection. Reflection is not daydreaming. It is guided analysis. Critical thinkers build regular practices that force examination. Writing is one of the most powerful tools here. When you write, vague impressions become explicit claims. Gaps in reasoning become visible. Contradictions surface. A system might include journaling about decisions, summarizing arguments in your own words, or explaining ideas as if teaching someone else. These practices externalize thinking, making it easier to evaluate. Another key component is decision auditing. Most people evaluate decisions based on outcomes alone. This is a mistake. Outcomes are influenced by chance, A good decision can lead to a bad result. A bad decision can lead to a good result. Critical thinkers separate decision quality from outcome quality. They review decisions by examining the information available at the time, the reasoning used, and the alternatives considered. This builds learning rather than self-blame. A critical thinking system also includes explicit standards of belief. Without standards, beliefs drift. People accept ideas based on familiarity, repetition, or social approval. Standards act as filters. What level of evidence is required before accepting a claim? What sources are considered credible? How much uncertainty is tolerated? These standards should be written, not assumed. Writing them down forces clarity and consistency. Another essential element is calibration. Calibration is the alignment between confidence and accuracy. Poor thinkers are often overconfident or underconfident. Critical thinkers aim for proportional confidence. They adjust belief strength as evidence changes. A system supports calibration by encouraging probability-based thinking rather than absolute conclusions. Instead of true or false, beliefs are held with degrees of confidence that evolve over time. The chapter also emphasizes the role of feedback. Thinking improves when errors are exposed, but feedback is uncomfortable. Most people avoid it. Critical thinkers seek it deliberately. They invite critique from people who are honest and competent, not merely agreeable. They listen for patterns in criticism rather than dismissing individual comments. Feedback is treated as data, not as judgment. Another critical element is intellectual diversity. A system that only engages with familiar perspectives stagnates. Exposure to thoughtful disagreement strengthens reasoning. This does not mean consuming random opposing views. It means engaging with the strongest versions of alternative positions. Critical thinkers look for arguments that challenge their beliefs intelligently. They test ideas under stress rather than protecting them. This chapter also addresses the importance of slow thinking rituals. In a fast-paced world, speed is rewarded, but speed increases error. Critical thinkers create rituals that slow thinking at key moments. Checklists before major decisions. Mandatory waiting periods before commitments. Second-look reviews for high-impact choices. These rituals reduce impulsivity and improve consistency. Another powerful concept introduced is meta-thinking. Meta-thinking is thinking about how you think. A critical thinking system includes regular examination of thinking habits themselves. What types of errors recur? Under what conditions reasoning degrades? Which biases appear most frequently? This self-observation transforms thinking from an unconscious process into a skill that can be refined. The chapter also explores the role of emotional hygiene. Emotions influence thinking even when ignored. Suppressed emotion leaks into judgment indirectly. A system acknowledges emotion explicitly. Naming emotion reduces its control. Separating emotional response from evaluative judgment preserves clarity. Critical thinkers do not aim to eliminate emotion. They aim to prevent emotion from hijacking reasoning. Another important component is environment design. Willpower is weak. Environment is strong. Critical thinkers shape their environment to support good thinking. They reduce distractions. They create physical and digital spaces that encourage focus. They limit notifications. They structure time to allow deep thinking. These changes may seem small, but their cumulative effect is significant. The chapter also highlights the importance of consistency over intensity. Thinking well occasionally is not enough. Errors compound over time. Small improvements applied consistently produce large gains. A system ensures that critical thinking is applied even when motivation is low. Habits replace effort. Structure replaces intention. One of the most difficult aspects discussed is patience. Critical thinking often delays gratification. Clear understanding takes time. Many people abandon good reasoning because results are not immediate. A system protects patience by focusing on process rather than outcome. When the process is sound, outcomes improve over time, even if short-term results fluctuate. The chapter also addresses intellectual humility as a system component. Humility is not a personality trait. It is a practice. It involves regularly updating beliefs, admitting uncertainty, and acknowledging error without defensiveness. A system normalizes these behaviors. Changing your mind becomes expected rather than embarrassing. Another key idea is cumulative advantage. Small thinking errors repeated over years shape lives. Likewise, small improvements in thinking compound into significant advantages. Better decisions, fewer regrets, more accurate beliefs. Over time, this creates a gap between those who think systematically and those who rely on intuition alone. As the chapter approaches its conclusion, it emphasizes that critical thinking mastery is not about becoming exceptional in isolated moments. It is about becoming reliable over time. Reliability is rare. Most people are inconsistent. They think well sometimes and poorly at others. A system reduces this variance. Chapter 8. Recognizing cognitive biases and thinking without distortion. Humans are wired to simplify the world. Simplification is efficient, but it comes at a cost: distortion. Every decision we make, every judgment we form, is filtered through mental shortcuts, heuristics that often mislead us. This chapter examines cognitive biases, the hidden forces shaping thought, the traps that make logic optional, and the methods for seeing reality more clearly. Mastery of critical thinking requires more than knowledge. It requires self-awareness, discipline, and the ability to notice when your own mind is deceiving you. Cognitive biases are not signs of weakness. They are survival tools that helped our ancestors act quickly under uncertainty. Pattern recognition, for instance, allowed humans to spot predators before fully analyzing the situation. Today, these same shortcuts often misfire. A stock market trend feels like a reliable signal. A viral social media post feels like undeniable truth. Understanding biases begins with recognizing that speed and efficiency in thinking do not always equal accuracy. One of the first biases explored is confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms existing beliefs. People rarely seek truth impartially. Instead, they unconsciously construct arguments in favor of what they already think. Critical thinkers combat this by actively seeking disconfirming evidence, treating it as equally valuable as confirming evidence. Without this balance, reasoning becomes justification, not discovery. Another common bias is anchoring. Initial exposure to numbers, ideas, or opinions creates a mental anchor that influences subsequent judgments. For example, the first price seen for a product affects what someone considers reasonable. Anchoring works subtly, often unnoticed, shaping negotiation, perception, and evaluation. Recognizing anchors allows critical thinkers to pause, adjust, and avoid automatic acceptance of first impressions. Availability bias is another distortion that distorts perception of frequency or probability. Dramatic events or vivid stories stick in memory more easily than mundane facts. Plane crashes are feared far more than car accidents, despite statistics showing the opposite. Critical thinkers mitigate availability bias by comparing impressions against objective data and resisting the emotional pull of memorable anecdotes. The chapter highlights the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue an endeavor because of prior investment, regardless of current rationality. People persist in failing projects, relationships, or habits because they cannot let go of what they have already spent. Mastery of critical thinking requires learning to evaluate actions based on present and future value, not past commitment. Rational evaluation demands detachment, not loyalty to previous decisions. Overconfidence bias also undermines reasoning. Many individuals overestimate their knowledge, ability, or predictive power. This bias is subtle because confidence feels convincing. Experts are not immune. They may project certainty to maintain authority or influence. Critical thinkers counter overconfidence by routinely calibrating beliefs against outcomes, tracking errors, and acknowledging uncertainty as a strength rather than a weakness. Another bias is the halo effect, where general impressions influence judgment of specific traits. A charismatic speaker can appear more knowledgeable than they are. Attractive individuals may be assumed competent. Critical thinkers separate qualities from perception. They evaluate claims and evidence independently of the person presenting them, avoiding shortcuts that feel socially comfortable but intellectually dangerous. The chapter explores groupthink, the tendency for cohesive groups to suppress dissent and prioritize consensus. Social harmony often outweighs truth. Leaders unconsciously pressure conformity. Members self-censor to avoid conflict. Critical thinkers recognize groupthink by actively encouraging dissent, questioning assumptions, and evaluating evidence before accepting majority opinions. Avoiding groupthink is essential for rational collective decisions. Biases in memory and attribution are also discussed. People misremember events to favor themselves or to fit existing narratives. Successes are attributed internally, failures externally. This distorts self-assessment and decision-making. Mastering critical thinking involves journaling experiences, comparing perceptions with objective records, and being willing to revise personal narratives honestly. The chapter emphasizes emotional biases, when feelings override logic. Fear, anger, and excitement warp evaluation. Emotional attachment can create selective attention, dismissing contrary evidence. Critical thinkers practice emotional regulation, labeling feelings, and separating them from judgment. This does not eliminate emotion. It channels it productively, preventing distortion of reasoning. Another cognitive trap discussed is the illusion of causality. People often infer cause and effect relationships from mere correlation. Superstitions, incorrect policy conclusions, and poor business decisions stem from this illusion. Critical thinkers examine mechanisms, seek alternative explanations, and test hypotheses empirically rather than relying on intuition alone. The chapter also introduces bias mitigation techniques. Awareness alone is insufficient. Systematic strategies are necessary. Techniques include structured analytic methods, checklists to question assumptions, devil's advocacy to challenge consensus, and probabilistic reasoning to quantify uncertainty. These tools externalize thinking, creating checkpoints that reduce reliance on flawed mental shortcuts. Biases can also accumulate in combination. For instance, confirmation bias may amplify overconfidence, while groupthink reinforces sunk cost fallacy. Awareness of one bias is insufficient. Critical thinkers cultivate a broad understanding of multiple biases and monitor their interactions. Systems for thinking, as described in earlier chapters, help maintain this vigilance. The chapter emphasizes that even the most disciplined minds are vulnerable. Cognitive biases are universal, automatic, and often unconscious. Humility and vigilance are central to managing them. Mastery of critical thinking is not the elimination of bias, but the recognition and correction of bias systematically. Finally, The chapter stresses the importance of continuous practice. Biases re-emerge when vigilance wanes. Everyday decisions, professional judgments, and social interactions all present opportunities for distortion. A lifelong commitment to examining one's own reasoning, seeking feedback, and testing assumptions is necessary for sustained improvement. The chapter concludes with a reminder: the mind is powerful but fallible. Cognitive biases are not flaws to be ashamed of. They are natural byproducts of an adaptive system. The key is not denial of error, but disciplined awareness. Critical thinkers succeed not because they are perfect, but because they build habits and systems to detect and correct distortion consistently. Mastering this chapter equips the reader with the ability to see beyond immediate impressions, challenge automatic judgments, and approach information with structured skepticism. It transforms thinking from reactive to deliberate, from vulnerable to resilient, and from biased to progressively more aligned with reality. Chapter 9: Questioning Assumptions and Challenging Conventional Wisdom. Critical thinking begins with a single question: why do we believe what we believe? Most people accept assumptions unconsciously, adopting ideas simply because they are familiar, widely accepted, or repeated. Conventional wisdom often masquerades as truth, and challenging it can feel uncomfortable or even threatening. This chapter explores how questioning assumptions forms the foundation of critical thinking mastery, and how to do it systematically without falling into cynicism or paralysis. Assumptions are the silent drivers of thought. They operate invisibly, guiding interpretation, judgment, and decision-making. Some assumptions are practical. They help navigate daily life efficiently. Others are outdated, unexamined, or inaccurate, subtly shaping beliefs and actions in ways that reduce clarity and effectiveness. Critical thinkers cultivate the skill of detecting these hidden assumptions and evaluating them consciously. The chapter begins by explaining the difference between explicit and implicit assumptions. Explicit assumptions are stated openly, like a rule or policy. Implicit assumptions are hidden, often invisible, even to the thinker. For example, in business, a manager might assume that higher sales automatically indicate customer satisfaction. This is an implicit assumption because it is rarely questioned, yet it can distort analysis and lead to flawed decisions. One method to uncover assumptions is to ask fundamental questions repeatedly. What must be true for this statement to be valid? What evidence supports it? Could the opposite be true? This technique, sometimes called the 5 whys or iterative questioning, penetrates the surface of superficial reasoning and exposes underlying beliefs. By examining each layer, critical thinkers separate assumptions from verified facts. Another focus of the chapter is cultural and social assumptions. People inherit beliefs from family, education, religion, and media. Many of these go unquestioned because challenging them feels like betrayal or social risk. Critical thinking requires courage to examine cultural norms without disrespect or automatic rejection. For example, common narratives about success, morality, or intelligence may not hold under scrutiny, yet they strongly influence behavior. The chapter emphasizes the danger of group conformity in reinforcing assumptions. When a community shares an unexamined belief, individuals internalize it automatically. People assume that agreement equals correctness. This is particularly evident in business, politics, and online discourse, where collective repetition creates an illusion of truth. Independent evaluation of ideas is essential to prevent being swept along by social momentum. Questioning assumptions is not about rejecting everything. It is about evaluating claims on evidence rather than tradition, popularity, or authority. Some conventional wisdom is valid, but its validity must be verified through reasoned inquiry. Critical thinkers balance skepticism with openness, avoiding both gullibility and cynicism. The chapter stresses that productive doubt is iterative, deliberate, and evidence-driven. The chapter also introduces mental exercises to enhance assumption detection. One exercise involves listing all assumptions behind a decision or belief, then assessing each for evidence, alternatives, and potential bias. Another exercise is role reversal, considering the opposite perspective as if it were true. These techniques reduce blind spots and strengthen reasoning by exposing vulnerabilities in thinking that are otherwise invisible. Bias intersects strongly with assumptions. Confirmation bias, overconfidence, and authority bias reinforce unexamined beliefs. A critical thinker must recognize when assumptions are reinforced not by evidence, but by emotional comfort, social approval, or habit. Awareness of these reinforcing mechanisms is a prerequisite to independent, objective evaluation. An essential part of this chapter is understanding the difference between facts and interpretations. People often mistake interpretations as immutable truths. For instance, interpreting a failure as evidence of personal inadequacy is not a fact. It is a conclusion shaped by assumptions about worth and competence. Critical thinkers separate observable evidence from personal or cultural interpretation, allowing for more accurate judgment. The chapter also explores historical examples where unquestioned assumptions led to errors. Scientific paradigms, economic theories, and social policies were often accepted for generations despite flaws, until someone challenged the underlying assumptions. These stories illustrate the cumulative cost of unexamined beliefs and the power of questioning to drive progress. Another key idea is the interplay between assumptions and goals. Many decisions implicitly assume that current objectives are fixed, optimal, or unquestionable. Critical thinkers periodically reevaluate goals themselves, not just strategies for achieving them. Are the objectives realistic, ethical, and evidence-based? Are they influenced by social pressure or past habits? This meta-level questioning strengthens both reasoning and decision-making. The chapter provides practical guidance for challenging conventional wisdom. Step 1. Identify the dominant narrative. Step 2. Determine what assumptions support it. Step 3. Gather evidence that confirms or contradicts each assumption. Step 4. Explore alternative interpretations. Step 5. Revise conclusions based on reasoned evaluation rather than habit, fear, or authority. Following this process cultivates clarity, intellectual independence, and adaptive thinking. Another significant theme is emotional attachment to assumptions. People often defend their beliefs because they define identity, social belonging, or self-esteem. Questioning these assumptions can trigger discomfort. Critical thinkers learn to tolerate this discomfort as part of the process. Emotional self-awareness prevents defensive reactions from undermining inquiry. The chapter also warns against cognitive laziness. Assumptions are often convenient shortcuts. Evaluating them thoroughly requires effort, patience, and mental discipline. Many people abandon this work for immediate comfort or consensus approval. Developing a habit of deliberate questioning creates resilience against mental shortcuts, improving judgment in complex and ambiguous situations. Critical thinkers also recognize that assumptions evolve over time. What was reasonable yesterday may be obsolete today. Regular reassessment ensures beliefs remain aligned with reality. This is particularly important in fast-changing fields like technology, economics, and social systems, where outdated assumptions can accumulate invisible costs. The chapter introduces tools to externalize assumption analysis. Writing, diagrams, and structured debates make assumptions visible. Once externalized, they can be critically examined without emotional interference. This is far more effective than attempting internal mental review alone, which is vulnerable to bias and selective attention. The chapter closes by emphasizing the balance between doubt and action. Questioning assumptions is essential, but over-analysis can lead to paralysis. Critical thinking is not mere skepticism. It is disciplined inquiry. Systems, habits, and mental frameworks developed in previous chapters support this balance, allowing rigorous evaluation while maintaining decisiveness. Finally, the chapter asserts that the mastery of assumption questioning is transformative. It changes how people interpret information, evaluate arguments, and make decisions. It reduces susceptibility to manipulation, enhances creativity, and fosters intellectual autonomy. Questioning assumptions turns thinking from reactive and superficial into proactive, adaptive, and resilient. It is one of the defining characteristics of those who truly master critical thinking. Chapter 10: Decision-Making Under Uncertainty and the Path to Mastery. In life, most decisions are made under uncertainty. Rarely do we have complete information, perfect clarity, or guaranteed outcomes. Yet, despite the inherent ambiguity of the world, many people act as if certainty exists, creating false confidence and avoidable errors. This chapter explores how to approach decision-making methodically, reduce error, and build systems that allow rational, effective choices even in unpredictable circumstances. Understanding uncertainty is not a limitation. It is the gateway to true critical thinking mastery. The first principle of decision-making under uncertainty is recognizing what is known versus what is unknown. People often conflate belief with fact, assuming familiarity implies comprehension. Critical thinkers separate these elements, identifying gaps in knowledge and quantifying uncertainty where possible. This practice transforms vague intuition into structured evaluation. For instance, an investor evaluating a new market must distinguish between verified trends, statistical probabilities, and assumptions, rather than relying solely on intuition or hearsay. Probabilistic thinking is a cornerstone of mastering uncertainty. Instead of categorizing outcomes as simply likely or unlikely, critical thinkers assign degrees of confidence to predictions. This allows flexibility and preparedness. A single decision is rarely deterministic. Viewing it probabilistically prevents overcommitment to one expected outcome. Probabilistic reasoning also helps in aggregating multiple scenarios, preparing strategies that remain effective even when initial assumptions fail. The chapter emphasizes structured decision frameworks. A framework forces the mind to process all relevant variables systematically. For example, decision trees, cost-benefit analyses, and scenario mapping externalize thought, making assumptions, contingencies, and trade-offs visible. Without frameworks, decisions rely on memory and intuition, increasing susceptibility to biases and error. Structured approaches reduce cognitive load while increasing reliability. Another critical focus is risk assessment. Humans are notoriously poor at judging risk. Emotional reactions, vivid anecdotes, and social influence distort perception of probability. The chapter highlights techniques to separate emotion from evaluation. Critical thinkers quantify risk where possible, compare it across alternatives, and consider worst-case scenarios realistically. They accept that risk is inherent and manage it rationally, rather than pretending it does not exist. The chapter introduces the concept of adaptive strategies. Uncertainty requires flexibility. Rigid adherence to a single plan in a dynamic environment is a formula for failure. Critical thinkers design decisions with feedback loops, allowing ongoing evaluation and adjustment. This involves setting checkpoints, monitoring outcomes, and being willing to pivot when evidence indicates a better course of action. Adaptability transforms uncertainty from a threat into a strategic advantage. Decision-making under uncertainty is also enhanced by perspective-taking. People often view decisions narrowly, focusing only on immediate effects or personal gain. Broadening the lens, considering long-term consequences, stakeholder perspectives, and systemic interactions, reduces blind spots and improves outcomes. Examples include policymaking, strategic business planning, and complex problem solving, where short-term solutions may fail without understanding broader dynamics. The chapter explores the interplay between cognitive biases and uncertain environments. Under stress or ambiguity, biases like overconfidence, anchoring, and availability bias intensify. Critical thinkers build safeguards, structured reflection, deliberate slow thinking, and seeking disconfirming evidence. Recognizing these patterns prevents impulsive or skewed decisions and ensures reasoning remains aligned with reality rather than comfort or habit. The chapter also examines heuristics, mental shortcuts that speed decision-making. Heuristics are useful but must be applied cautiously.